Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy.
With Amex Platinum, you can enjoy access to dedicated card member entrances at select events because skipping the line makes you the star of game day. That's the powerful backing of American Express. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/withAmex. Card member entrance access not limited to Amex Platinum card.
Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from Football. Its History for 5 Centuries. Written by Montague, Shearman and James E. Vincent. Published in 1885, this story looks at the history of football. My name is Teddy, and I am to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest that you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those new to the podcast, it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we've built together. The podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with the support from subscribers and patrons, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. Thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether through the website or their podcast app. My goal is to keep this podcast free and accessible for everyone. That is why you hear the quick ad from Spotify at the beginning of each episode. It helps generate financial support for the creation of the podcast. Support from listeners via Patreon and Spotify also play a crucial role. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, there are a few ways you can help out. Follow the podcast in your podcast app and leave a comment. And become a subscriber for $2.99 per month. This also removes Spotify ads and helps support episode creation. If subscribing is not possible, an easy way to help is simply by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. If you would ever like to say hello, you can do so by visiting me at boytosleep.com. You can support the podcast there and become a patron on Patreon. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the ratings. Football. Its History for 5 Centuries by Montague, Shearman and James E. Vincent. Preface. The authors who welcome this opportunity of addressing their readers through the conventional channel of a preface have not written without an object. That object has not been to teach the art of football, which art can only be attained by practice. It has been to collect the scattered and fragmentary knowledge which surrounds the history of an ancient pastime. In the pursuit of this object, they have performed the pleasant duty of exploring many literary storehouses, and have not seldom been compelled to wander far out of the beaten track. they will have attained their object if they can pass on to their readers 1/10 of the delight which resulted to themselves from their wanderings. There also resulted a theory, which was not adopted without anxious argument, that the games of football now in vogue owe their origin almost entirely to the public schools. At the same time, football has a history which has been faithfully followed. In addition to the thanks which we cannot adequately express to ancient authors, we owe a debt of gratitude to Walter Rye, Esquire, than whom none is better versed in the antiquities of sport, for valuable advice as to sources of information. National taste, or a national trait, is under consideration. Sound criticism often falls from a foreign observer. At the present day, an American novelist whose subtle analysis of character is charming English readers has pronounced his opinion that an Englishman is only to be understood and appreciated when he is seen out of doors in a flannel suit, while a French critic goes further and assigns a narrower sphere to British ability by making the observation that an Englishman is only perfectly happy when he has a ball to play with. Certain it is that, good as they are in any branch of sport, it is in games in which a ball of any kind is used that the members of the English race are the most enthusiastic and proficient players. There is another feature too in such games which renders them peculiarly interesting. They have all an ancient and an honourable history. So far back, indeed, does the history of the different kinds of ball play reach, that the investigation of their origin, and for the present in particular of the earliest records of the game of football, can hardly fail to produce interesting fruit. The most learned historian of sports and pastimes, Joseph Strutt, indulges in an elaborate antiquarian inquiry into the origin of the ball, having recourse to the most ancient of the classics for his authorities. Handball, he says, is, if Homer may be accredited, coeval at least with the destruction of Troy. Herodotus attributes the invention of the ball to the Lydians. Succeeding writers have affirmed that a female of distinction named Anagala, a native of Corcyra, was the first who made a ball for the purposes of past time, which she presented to Nausicaa, the daughter of Alcinous, king of Phaeacia, and at the same time taught her how to use it. To emphasize his authority, the antiquary quotes 3 lines from the Pope's Odyssey. O'er the green mead the sporting virgins play, their shining veils unbound along the skies. Tossed and retossed, the ball incessant flies. The same author is much, and it would seem somewhat unnecessarily, distressed at the fact that the writer of a 14th century manuscript preserved in Trinity College, Oxford, and the Venerable Bede are not in harmony as to the early capacities of the athletic saint Cuthbert. The former says of him that he play at bow with the children that his fellows were, while the latter merely makes mention of his general excellence at games, involving great muscular exertion. The plain fact of the matter is that the origin of the ball is one of those matters which must of necessity be lost in antiquity. Nature herself supplies an endless variety of balls of all sizes, suitable for throwing from hand to hand, and the act of playing with them is instinctive. The apple and the orange are, so to speak, objects which nature supplies, not only as objects of food, but also as materials for pastime. Clay, too, and snow are of so plastic a nature that the hands even of children naturally mould them into a spherical form and hurl them to and fro in sport. Before, however, an attempt be made to show how the game of football became developed as a specific sport, it is without doubt the duty of sober historians first to chronicle the legends which have attached themselves to the foundation of the game. Firstly, it is said that in ancient times it was custom to kick a large stone from parish to parish, both in Scotland and in England, for the purpose of marking boundaries and asserting rights of way. Certain it is, at any rate, that the practice of kicking a leather ball over a path of Whit Monday for the purpose of exercising a right of way endured into the present century in the Isle of Purbeck in Dorsetshire, a ball being annually presented to the workmen of certain quarries for that purpose. But the origin of the practice, both in that locality and in some other parts of the country where it is known to have been followed, is shrouded in antiquity, and there is little evidence to show that the practice caused the rise of football, instead of having arisen at a time when the game itself was well known. This latter view seems the most probable. The second legend of the origin of the game is one of a gruesome character, and far more suitable to be chronicled in connection with the legendary or mythical stage of history. Perhaps it is best to give these two legends as in duty bound, and then to pass on to matters which are of unquestioned historical accuracy. Indeed, were it not for these legends, it would seem obvious that the football, as distinguished from the handball, was the product of civilization and invention. Such indeed it seems to have been in fact, although it must be confessed that the subjoined explanation of the origin of the football is in part hypothetical and based upon a priori grounds. It is probable that the first football was the Roman phallus, or inflated bladder, of which Marshall speaks when he advises boys and old men alike to play for it. But the phallus was, primarily at least, a handball, and a bladder was probably used first for that purpose, for the simple reason that it was able, on account of its lightness, to be struck into the air with the hand without pain, and with ease. At some uncertain but momentous date, an impetuous player must, after missing the ball with his hand, have kicked out petulantly with his sandaled foot, and so unconsciously made the first experiment in the art of drop kicking or punting. Swiftly and strongly the ball flew, farther than it could be cast by the strongest arm, or smitten by the lustiest hand, and this must inevitably have been the first step to the later development of the game played with the phallus. When it was kicked with the foot or struck with the hand at discretion, and convenience. Be this as it may, it is probable that the Romans, along with their other habits and fashions, imported the various games which they played with the phallus or with other kinds of ball. One of these balls used by the Romans, and by them derived from the Greeks, was the harpustum, the game played with which was that the players of one side should try to carry the ball over a line defended by the other side, a pastime which bears no small resemblance to the game of hurling, which we shall describe later. But whether football was really introduced into Britain by the Romans, or whether it be an indigenous product of the country, with the exception of the one doubtful reference to an anonymous manuscript to which allusion has formerly been made, we do not find any mention of the game in the annals of our Anglo-Saxon progenitors, and it is not until the 13th century that we find genuine historical authority on the subject. Chapter 2. History of Football Before the Puritan Era. The first mention of the game of football in English history is made by Fitzstephen, who, writing in the 13th century, says, "Annually upon Shrove Tuesday, they, the London schoolboys, go into the fields immediately after dinner and play at the celebrated game of ball." But it is only fair to add that the learned Strutt himself never felt certain that the reference here was to football. He tells us in his commentary upon the passage that Stowe, in his explanation of the words, has added, without the least sanction from the Latin, the word bastion, meaning a bat or cudgel, being of opinion that the game signified was something of the nature of golf, or bandy ball, which is also known as hockey. If Stowe was guilty of this bold gloss, and there is no question that he was, then it is clear that the game of the London schoolboys is as likely to have been football as anything else, although Strutt is of the contrary opinion, for Strutt's view is based upon the ground that football as a pastime does not seem to be a very proper game for children. On the other hand, there are strong reasons for believing that this game may have been football, for in the first place, there is good historical evidence to the effect that Shrove Tuesday was a regular day upon which London apprentices and those of other great cities, such as Chester and the Scotch peasants, regularly indulged in the game of football. This evidence will be set forth immediately. But it is also a matter to be noted that London is one of the places where football seems never to have died out, while the London schools, notably Westminster and the Charterhouse, were the places in which one species of the game of football was kept alive in a period of great athletic depression, to emerge at the time of the recent athletic revival in the form of the association game. That this game flourished in the succeeding century is manifest from the fact that Edward III in AD 1349 found it necessary to forbid it by law. This warlike monarch, who was not quite of the same opinion as a man of at least equally military mind, the Duke of Wellington, sent a formal letter of complaint to the sheriffs of the City of London that the skill in shooting with arrows was almost totally laid aside for the purpose of various useless and unlawful games, and they were thenceforth enjoined to prohibit all such idle practices, as far as their jurisdiction extended. Football, however, seemed to have sufficient vitality to outlast the pressure of a statute which, like some of those at present directed against gambling and betting, seems to have been more honoured in the breach than in the observance, for we find that in 1389 another act was passed by Richard II for the purpose of encouraging shooting at the expense of other sports. This act expressly forbade throughout the kingdom all playing at tennis, football, and other games called courts, dice, casting of the stone, cales, a kind of skittles, and other importune games. How great must have been the moral effect of the statute we see from the fact that it had to be reenacted by Henry IV in 1401, and again by Henry VIII, considerably more than 100 years later, while the last named monarch also passed an enactment rendering it a penal offence for any person whatever to attempt to make gain by keeping a house or ground for sporting purposes of any kind, an enactment which some of the present managers of gate money meetings for amateurs would be doubtless sorry to see replaced upon the statute book. Another clause of the same act made it a penal offence for an artificer to play at any of the games mentioned above, save at Christmastide. In Scotland also similar measures were pursued for the purpose of separating those canny sportsmen from their well-loved games of golf and football, for in 1458 James III of Scotland decreed that displays of weapons were to be held 4 times a year, and that football and golf be utterly put down. 2 other pieces of evidence show how constant and vain was the effort made by our sovereigns to suppress a national sport. Twice in the reign of Elizabeth was proclamation made that no football play be used or suffered within the city of London and the liberties thereof, upon pain of imprisonment. And twice were entries of the proclamations having been made entered in the books of the Corporation of London upon November 27th, 1572, and November 7th, 1581, where they can be seen to this day. But in spite of prohibition and threat of fine and imprisonment, the London apprentices and the country labourers were determined to enjoy their football, and the game was probably never so flourishing or so prosperous as it was throughout the 16th century. And now it may be asked, what manner of game was this football, which delighted our forefathers so hugely that they persisted in indulging in it, although under ban of the law? Strange to say, there was not the chaos of conflicting rules which were found in use when the game was brought into prominence, again a few decades ago. The original game appears to have been of the simplest description. Given 2 boundaries or goals, a ball of any make so long as it was strong enough to prevent its being torn in pieces, and the opposing sides were allowed to get the ball on and make it touch the adversary's goal in any manner whatever they pleased, whether by kicking, hurling, shoving or running, or by stealth. Sometimes we hear of goals a mile or more apart. Often the arena of play was a street or a high road, sometimes a whole town, and the attacking party with the ball would try and sneak round by by-streets in order to escape notice, and plant the ball unawares through the window or against the post which was fixed as the goal. The game, in short, when played in a confined space, was none other than a rough form of the present rugby union football, without the rules and prohibitions which have now reduced to order and civilized that game. But it must have been a rough game, that of which the yokels and prentices of merry England were so fond, and of broken pates and aching shins there must have been not a few. But let us hear what the writers of the age had to say about it. But before we proceed to give a few extracts of their views, we must premise that football has always been looked upon as a vulgar game, a game for clodhoppers, Irish kerns, and prentice lads, which a gentleman of quality should shun, lest perchance his eye be blackened or his skin be raised in lumps by a white of low degree. Hence we can only expect the writers of gentle birth of the age of Elizabeth and James I, and indeed of all the later ages up to the present generation, to look upon so rough a game as unfitting for a man of refinement. But a game does not need to be defended now, because it brings men of different rank to meet on equal terms with no favour. And ardent footballers might indeed be still able to adhere to their game, although it had been deemed vulgar by James I and by Sir Thomas Eliot. Nor is there anything in the contempt of these dignitaries which will depress the spirits or hurt the sensitive pride of the football player, especially for he will find upon study that football was not the only game condemned by the aristocratic classes. On the contrary, almost all athletic exercises which did not immediately and obviously conduce to knightly skill were held in equally low esteem, and the game of cricket itself was equally lightly regarded. In fact, it is not too much to say that it was not until the present century was well advanced that men of gentle birth and education gave up putting away boyish sports when they reached man's estates. But of this we shall speak later. The earliest writers who discuss football critically are of the Elizabethan era. We have indeed been informed by a learned antiquary, to whom we are largely indebted for the materials of this work, that many years before this there flourished in the city of London a guild of football players. But as our friend has lost his reference to this, the first football club in existence, and as we have been unable, with much searching, to recover the clue, we are unable to present to our readers any report of exciting matches between the representatives of the various wards, or between the opposing teams in the cities of London and Westminster. But of the fact that such an organization existed, we feel little or no doubt, and only regret we cannot give more accurate information on the subject. We can only close our notice of the subject by transcribing the comment of the gentle scholar, to whom we are indebted for the suggestion that probably the players, recognizing the danger of the game to the soul and body, thought it necessary to combine to employ a special chirurgeon and a special chaplain of their own, from which it will be seen that our friend is more fond of antiquities than he is of football. The first Elizabethan critic of football, whose words deserve quotation, is Sir Thomas Eliot, the author of the book called The Governor, a species of educational manual for the young noblemen and gentlemen of the age. Writing in 1583 of the sports which should be indulged in by those of gentle birth, he expounds views which, seen through the glass of the opinions of the 19th century, appear strange. Archery he praises above tennis, because in tennis a player is compelled to play as hard as his opponent, and cannot, so to speak, make his own pace, so that if he, the opponent, strike the ball hard, the other that intendeth to receive him is then constrained to use some play or violence in the will to return the ball. And bowls and pins and skittles and quoiting are also spoken of with disfavour as being too furious, and the writer then goes on. We quote verbatim, leaving more learned critics to explain the worthy knight's grammar. Verily, as for to the last, i.e. pins and quoiting, be to be utterly objected to all noble men, in likewise football, wherein is nothing but beastly fury and extreme violence, whereof proceedeth hurt and consequently rancour, and malice do remain with them that be wounded, wherefore it is to be put in perpetual silence. Perhaps this view would have been coincided with by a certain bridge groom, whom we read elsewhere to have attended the revels held at Kenilworth in honour of Queen Elizabeth in 1575. For the gentleman in question, we gather from a letter of the gallant Captain Laneman to have been lame of a leg that in his youth was broken at football, but modern footballers would hardly agree with Sir Thomas, or with the learned and pious Puritan writer, Stubbs, who in our quotations follows on the same side. Stubbs, in his Anatomy of Abuses in the Realm of England in 1583, not only objected to football for itself, but also for that it was generally played, both in town and village, on Sunday, and one of his reasons for believing that the day of doom, as foretold in scriptural revelation, was at hand, that football playing and other devilish pastimes were played on Sunday. Lord, he prays, remove these exercises from the Sabbath. What follows is curious in answer to a question as to whether football playing is a profanation of the Sabbath, he says. Any exercise which withdrew us from godliness, either upon the Sabbath or any other day, is wicked and to be forbidden. Now who is so grossly blind that seeth not that these aforesaid exercises not only withdraw us from godliness and virtue, but also hail and allure us to wickedness and sin? For as concerning football playing, I protest unto you, it may rather be called a friendly kind of fight than a play or recreation, a bloody and murthering practice than a fallow sport or pastime. For doth not every one lie in wait for his adversary seeking to overthrow him, and pick on his nose, though it be on hard stones in ditch or dale, in valley or hill, or what place soever in he careth not, so he have not done him down. And he that can serve the most of this fashion, he is counted the only fellow, and who but he? We may remark incidentally that it is at least satisfactory to know that the footballers of the time of Elizabeth appreciated the advantages of a good tackler. But to resume with Stubbs, his opinions, so that by this means sometimes their necks are broken, sometimes their backs, sometimes their legs, sometimes their arms. But whoever scrapeth away the best goeth not scot-free, but is either forewounded, cased, or bruised, so as he dieth of it, or else scapeth, very hardy and no merveille, for they have the sleights to meet one betwixt two, to dash him against the heart with their elbows. So much for opinion of the pious Stubbs, who, it must be recollected, was a Puritan and one of the party, who afterwards almost succeeded in entirely putting down football during the supremacy of his opinions. Perhaps it will be as well to finish the hostile criticism with the opinion of King James I of England, who in this Basilicon Doron, a manual of education written for his son, after speaking in praise of various other sports, saith, "But from this account I do bar all rough and violent exercise, as the football meter for laming than making able the users thereof." Still James I, taking him for all in all, was something of an old woman, and can hardly be having expected to look with favour upon charge or a scrimmage. Added to this, we have something more than a suspicion that His Royal Highness, while posing as an original writer on education, was drawing a great many of his views from Sir Thomas Eliot, for the Basilicon Doron bears a most suspicious resemblance in many places to the work of the earlier writer. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story, and if you're not quite tired yet, please feel free to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.